little sleepy this morning, so we're a couple minutes behind, but we're just going to give the two panels their full time yet of 45 minutes. I'd like to introduce Hans-Georg Eichler, who will be our moderator for our first panel on bridging the chasm, connecting pre- and post-market learning. He's the Senior Medical Officer of EMA. Hans-Georg, the stage is yours.
Thank you. Good morning. Can I please ask my panelists to come up to the stage? So, Gerald. Oh, very good. Okay. So maybe we should all sit down. So good morning again. This is about chasms, this session. And the title is, it's a fireside chat, but I'm missing the fire, by the way. Okay, thank you very much.
It's a bonfire because we thought this would be a more controversial chat today.
It's a very different movie, yes.
Yeah. So rather than just a little nice fire, we're expecting fireworks from this group today.
So we end if this explodes. So it's about connecting the pre- and post-market learning. And Gigi and Mark asked me to use for a starting point for this an article that appeared almost to the day a year ago. And it was published in JAMA, and the authors were the then commissioner, I think, of FDA, Rob Caliif, Rachel Sherman, and Andrew Slavit from CMS. And the title was Knowing When and How to Use Medical Products, a Shared Responsibility for the FDA and CMS. And in that, actually, they don't address just one chasm. There are three chasms that they address. And the first is between regulators and payers. Regulators ask, can the drug work? Payers ask, will it work for my patients? So they have different information needs, and that creates tension. The second chasm is about pre versus post license learning. When I joined the regulatory community, the whole rage was about pre-license learning. So we need to know what does the drug do, then we give it a license, and then we're pretty done. I mean, we look for safety signals, but in principle we know. Well, that has obviously changed, and it's now a continuum. We have pre- and post-license learning. And the last chasm that comes up in this is really about methodology. So the workhorse of knowledge generation used to be the randomized controlled trial, but now is this new kid on the block, real-world evidence or real-world data. How can we bridge that chasm? So it's those three that we will be talking about. And let me be very clear, that goes for all of us. We will not talk about drug prices. That stays out of the room. We only talk about knowledge generation, all these chasms. So without further ado, let me introduce one by one our stellar panel that we have today. There's a lot of accumulated experience in this room. And I will start with Hilary Malone, Dr. Hilary Malone. She is Chief Regulatory Officer at Sanofi. So Hilary, you are at the receiving end of all of this. You get these different demands. I mean, what is the real impact of these different information needs, data requirements on your industry? Is it an issue?
Yeah, I think it's a huge issue. And so let me talk through what we do on a daily basis. So when we have products going through the portfolio, and I know this of Sanofi and a number of other companies, pretty much every other company, I think, for regulators, we develop to a target product profile, a regulated label. And that governs primary endpoints and randomized controlled trials. But what we have done and are doing increasingly is also in parallel, as one goes from phase 2 to phase 3, you develop to a target value proposition. Different companies have different nomenclature, but essentially in parallel to your regulators program, you're developing a program of evidence generation for payers, for formularies, and there is some overlap, like a Venn diagram, with the regulated endpoints, but often not. So this is when we start to get into, very large, very complex studies. We Janet yesterday talked about the 50 or 60-page case report form. Well, that's because you're having numerous secondary endpoints, tertiary endpoints, exploratory endpoints to try to generate evidence during those programs to meet the needs of increasingly diverse stakeholders other than regulators. And regulators are, also not harmonized in what they require. As emerging markets emerge, they ask for different endpoints as well. So if you have a finite R&D budget, our R&D budget in Sanofi is a little north of $6 billion, 6 billion euros rather, that eats up an awful lot of your budget, whether it's time, cost, complexity, and overall, the impact is it reduces the number of sort of shots that you have on goal. The more you backload into one phase 3 program, the fewer you can bring through from research. And ultimately, that is detrimental to patients.
Thank you so much. So you told us that there is an opportunity cost involved in that dissonance. And I think I like the Venn diagram, and I think we will have to come back in the end in your spirit of solutions. How can we bring the two parts of the Venn diagrams closer together? But maybe next, let's hear from our next panelist, Gerald Dal Pan, who is the Director of Office of Surveillance and Epidemiology at FDA. So you are sort of at the front end of what I talked about, the post-licensing knowledge generation, because that's where you come from. So what kind of data are needed for effective post-market research and analysis? Do we have them?
So right now we have a lot of data, but it would always be wonderful to have more. So the workhorse of this has been case reports. People think there's a problem with the medicine. They write to the company, they write to FDA, and say, I think there's a problem here. Now, in some cases, we can actually put together some of these, tell a story, and say, yes, there is something new we've learned about this medicine from these case reports. And over half our safety label changes actually are from this rather old-fashioned method. But there's a lot of things that we can't tell from these reports. And a lot of that exists when the suspected adverse reaction is actually a manifestation of the underlying disease or is otherwise common in the population. You can't tease out the effect of the medicine from other effects that may have independently caused this problem. So here we need other types of methods. Now, of course, a large randomized clinical trial might be able to tell us that, but that's quite costly, quite time-consuming, not very efficient. And if the outcome is quite rare, might not even be feasible. And so here we've worked for many years now with large databases, mainly administrative claims databases. We've had a long collaboration with CMS. We've worked with insurance databases. We've had contracts with medical schools and others who have access to these databases. And now we have, of course, the Sentinel system, which links together 18 such diverse, 17 or 18 such diverse data partners, we call them, who transform their data into a common data model. And we're able to query that through our partners up here at the Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare Research Institute. But when you look at these data, they are collected for a different reason. They're not collected specifically to answer drug safety questions. They're collected to either administer care or administer payments. We have less experience with capturing all the information in the electronic health record. So when we look at the kinds of things that precision medicine is doing, saying a person has this tumor with this histology, with this biomarker, and has not responded to XYZ treatments in the past, stringing all that together in a administrative claims database is not particularly easy at this point. So the more we look toward precision medicine, the more precise we want characterization of individuals to be, the better data we're going to need in that regard.
Very good, thank you. So we'll come back to what you just said about these databases. How can we make them fitter for use? But now, before we go there, let me introduce the third panelist, Trent Heywood. He is the Chief Medical Officer of Blue Cross Blue Shield. So you come from not CMS, but the private payer community. So can I ask you, will the role of post-marketing learning, that's what the wishful thinking here, will that increase in value to private payers?
Good morning. Yes, I definitely think that's going to, post-market surveillance is going to be more and more of our routine practice in the next 4 to 5 years as you continue to think about things, what Gerald just alluded to, which is precision medicine. There's no way that we'll be able to properly manage the innovation that's occurring in precision medicine without being able to do longitudinal studies, without being able to look across the entire United States. So we have like 106 million members that are part of Blue Cross and Blue Shield. You're going to need that level of breadth and depth and volume to be able to understand what we will be doing effectively for our membership. So we do see post-market surveillance, probably even more so than what the FDA is doing on the front end, as becoming a reality of what the insurance or the private payers will be doing in our space.
Okay, thank you. So listening to you all three, I see that you have made a few diagnoses. I'm a physician, so we learned, first you make a diagnosis, then you recommend a treatment. So you have made the diagnosis. Now let's come to the treatment. The first is the diagnosis. We have the Venn diagram, and it isn't very well overlapping. How can we remedy that? The second diagnosis that I heard is, I heard it between the lines, to be fair, that post-licensing knowledge generation is about safety. Right? Can we harness post-licensing learning in the broadest sense also for effectiveness? Whether it's relative effectiveness or is it effectiveness in patient group A versus patient group B, how can we improve the positioning of the medicines? And the last one is a practical one. We heard that these databases are for another use, fine, we know that, and that they are not always fit for purpose for what we have in mind. So how can we remedy and address these three questions? What is the therapy? Let me again start with Hilary. If you had a wish to get the regulators and the payers to agree on a common standard, that is what I heard you wish, what would you do?
So I think it's common data and common data standards. So they're sort of two different components. But I think in Europe there's been a number of examples where the health technology assessment bodies across Europe and the payers have come together and they have had common meetings with industry to talk about how do you come to some common ground. I think the experience there has been of somewhat limited success. And perhaps you could, inform us differently if that's the case. I think at best what we've achieved in those examples is a great deal of transparency between what the two bodies require, but no common ground. So I think the opportunity we have now with real-world evidence, with new tools, is really to be able to find at a lower cost and with broader applicability, new opportunities to grab information, to harness information and data. However, there has to be some move from regulators and payers towards accepting those new information bases and agreeing the same data standards. We can help support bringing that information together. There'll be many members of our healthcare environment which will work to bring information, but how you use it and how you agree on the utility of that information is going to be really important. And therefore, I guess my wish is that we find a way, keeping the patient at the forefront of what we're trying to achieve, we find a way to agree common ground on what information is useful and how it's going to be used. And today we don't have that.
Could I add, so I used to be at CMS. I was the Deputy Chief Medical Officer at CMS at some point, and building off what Hilary just said, I will say that there is a delineation distinction between reaching agreement about things that might be considered wasteful and of no value or benefit for what we want, so get rid of study designs that at the end of the day is not going to serve our particular common purposes. That's very different than reaching agreement about, at the end of the day, for a final decision as to whether you will or will not do certain things based upon the evidence. And I think it's important for us to make that type of delineation, because my experience when I was at CMS is that everybody wanted harmonization unless the final outcome went against your interests. And then they didn't want harmonization. Then they wanted forum shopping, then they wanted a different venue. And that's okay, because that's properly, particularly in the United States, that's very important, because you do want that type of innovation, particularly at least for the United States, is different than in the EU and other places, because you might not be always right as the government. And you might want opportunities to be able to show that the government was necessarily not fully appreciating what the innovation is that's occurring. And so in the US situation, we've always had some capacity or ability to be able to be heard in other places. What we've done more recently is try to increase what Hilary was just saying, trying to increase the transparency about what we're ultimately going to hold people accountable for, excuse me, so that there is transparency about the outcome of interest that we're seeking, so that you can know that on the front end, what the outcomes of interest that we're seeking. And then we can go through the process, and you may agree or disagree with the final decision that a particular payer may make. But what we're doing is trying to eliminate any waste. What you shouldn't have to be is in a situation where you thought you had a well-designed study, only to find for some reason they've changed the outcome of interest, and so now they're trying to argue that your study was poorly designed for the population that you're trying to serve.
So Trent, can I follow up with a very practical question? Assume you received for Blue Cross Blue Shield tomorrow an invitation to go to FDA and to discuss what Hilary described, a new protocol for a new study, a new product. Would you come?
Yes, that's easy. I don't have a problem doing that.
Hear, hear.
Trent, you do know you're being recorded.
Yeah, I know. Yes, yeah. So to me, that's consistent with serving our membership, right? That I don't think if you ask any Blue Cross and Blue Shield member that they'd find it acceptable to say that Blue Cross and Blue Shield didn't want to be at the room, didn't necessarily want to be at the table. And I imagine that's true for our national competitors, so it's not unique to Blue Cross and Blue Shield from that perspective, whether it be Aetna, Cigna, and others, United, Humana, Kaiser. I think all of them would say their membership would expect and that you would be at the table for those particular conversations. So I don't find that to be problematic or inconsistent with our beliefs.
Okay. Gerald, you heard him.
Right.
Would you be willing to invite him? Be careful.
Yeah.
You were the big bully, yeah? You called the shots, FDA. We say this is the end point. This is the study design. Now here come these new kids on the block and say, oh, maybe that's not the right end point. Would you be willing to tolerate that and listen?
So I think we're generally always willing to listen to better study designs. And we have lots of public meetings. I think if you looked at how we've tried to address something different from what we're talking about today, the opioid epidemic, we've had lots and lots of public meetings, including meetings with industry that would normally be just FDA and industry in a public setting. We had that about 2 years ago to look at how we could study this epidemic the best ways. We just finished one yesterday and the day before looking for novel ways to package opioids in ways that may reduce abuse. So I think we're very willing for public input on how to do things better. Yeah.
So,
all our guidance documents, by the way, go through public comment as well, and some of them are preceded by public workshops.
So like if we take that opioid example, and I'm doing a lot of work with that, and we have some data that the government wouldn't necessarily have, right? Because we have some utilization data, and we can look at it down to the individual zip code levels and be able to see geographic variability, environmental impacts, whether or not it's consistent or inconsistent with different industries. So we have a lot of things that you might not necessarily be able to look at, but this gets back to our original question about harmonization. At the end of the day, if you end up picking number need to treat or number need to harm, if you step outside the cancer patients, then in theory and in practice, FDA would be in a position if we were to come together and say that by and large, the number needed to treat for use of opioids is pretty poor in comparison to non-steroidals for pretty much everything outside of cancer. I haven't heard that statement yet. So there's been a lot of statements, but it hasn't necessarily been very, very strong statements pushing back saying, by and large, physicians shouldn't even be writing for opioids for most patient populations. So when we get into that room, those are the type of conversations we end up having to have about number need to treat it, number need to harm, those type of measures that is a little different than where traditional economists might come out with quality adjusted life years or disability adjusted life years, because I do think those are the type of measures that also lay people get. Lay people can understand, okay, if I take this medicine, what does it mean? What is the anticipated benefit? And so I think that would also be part of that discussion that we'd end up having if we were, in theory, invited to this conversation.
So Hilary, you heard from both these gentlemen to your left a willingness. Who stops you, what stops you from seeking a meeting with both of them in the same room when you have your next product?
So I think it's, we would absolutely welcome having one conversation. And we do speak to, all industry, I believe, speak to payers as you go through development, because you're trying to understand what are the requirements, what are the hurdles you're trying to meet. But it's the same challenge, I would guess, as our experience in Europe speaks to. Transparency is one thing, but there is no common ground. Let me give you a very specific example. So, we're in this fantastic Boston, biotech ecosystem, and I could throw a stone from here and, hit any number of startup, companies. But I would say the majority of those companies, and this is a sweeping statement, but many of those companies are looking at small, niche, orphan, rare disease. Most of them are not in the big cardiovascular, big diabetes epidemic spaces. Company like Sanofi, we're in diabetes. We have a phase 3 program for a new diabetes product and pre-approval to meet the needs, not of regulators, but to meet the needs of payers in the market. We are doing not one, but 2 outcome studies, pre-approval. The cost of those outcome studies, no surprise, is well north of €1 billion. If you have to invest that type of money up front, when you have a finite R&D budget of €6.5 billion, you can see simply that the numbers in the big categories, in the big spaces that are still poorly served, that are still requiring new innovation, you are essentially disincentivizing large areas of the healthcare environment, large areas of medical need, because it's just too expensive to be in.
But Hilary, you reinforce your diagnosis.
Right.
And I think we all heard the diagnosis, but what can we do to treat it? And I always thought, you were quite negative about the experience in Europe between payers and
because
regulators.
it's transparent, but we have to find common endpoints. We have to agree, I think.
I thought we did on
that
many
not,
things.
Well, this system is not sustainable, right, from a cost perspective. And so I think we all have to say, all of us across the continuum, that we have to fundamentally change the way in which we incentivize and reward and therefore look for data and evidence. We have to come to some common agreement around what you need pre-approval and what you are prepared to pay for as evidence is generated beyond randomized controlled trials, beyond the approval, as you're able to get much more experience, not just of safety data post-marketing, but more efficacy generation. That has to be incentivized in some way. And right now, we have, I think, incentives the wrong way around.
So Trent, what would you have to say to that? Would you be willing to incentivize them to get more efficacy data in the on-market phase?
I paused because I don't know what that means, because I know, particularly as it relates to pharmaceutical versus diagnostic and devices. And the reason why I'm pausing is because we're in our early infancy in terms of value-based outcomes and outcome-based contracting and what that really means. And so it's easy in theory to be able to say that you should be able to align the incentives and the alignment should unfold. But as we're in our early infancy in trying to structure value-based payment models, my experience is that it's even a slower, fraught with more issues, much more complex at being able to get the right incentives and alignments for those contracts than what we saw in what you might see traditionally when you were thinking about value-based payment incentives for providers in general. Doesn't mean it's not going to happen, and we're testing it as to one of the reasons why we've taken a step to say, okay, let's start off with a few of these specific areas, be able to see whether or not we can reach agreement with industry, with manufacturers, to be able to see, is that an acceptable outcome measure of interest in terms of effectiveness? If we can reach agreement on those type of outcomes of interest, and there's a lot of different ways people want to approach outcome measures, but if we can reach agreement in a way that we think can be consistent across different clinical conditions, then we think there's an opportunity to be able to start to align incentives, but it's early in its infancy, to be honest.
So Gerald, would you be willing to be part of this, to reach that agreement in the post-licensing space? What is an important outcome? And we're talking efficacy here now, or effectiveness, not safety.
So I think part of it, when you look at the kind of data we look at, be it for safety or efficacy, one of the fundamental problems we have is not knowing what a patient was treated for when they took a medicine. So when you look at all the databases we have, we can actually capture drug utilization fairly well. And there are algorithms for chronic use, short-term use, dosage, et cetera. But when a medicine can be used for more than one thing, it's very hard to capture that. And so if we're going to start looking at efficacy, and we have to do this for safety as well, we have to do this for safety as well. But it's what I said before. How do I know what the patient's been treated for? And if the ICD code says, let's say, atrial fibrillation, but I can't distinguish between valvular and non-valvular atrial fibrillation, and that distinction's important, what do I do then? Then I have to develop another algorithm, maybe look for mitral stenosis in the ICD codes or wherever. Now, one way to, I'm talking now about the claims data, the next frontier of this is to really explore how we can get data out of the EHRs to try to make some more precision to these categories, to really understand what it is we're really looking at to make the kinds of inferences we need. Then beyond that is how do we control for the confounding and the physician choice in directing one patient toward one treatment and another patient toward another treatment when that decision may be based on the ultimate outcome we're looking for. Epidemiologists call that channeling bias. And it would seem to me that that's just as important an issue with safety as it is for efficacy. So these are some of the things. I don't think they're insurmountable, but they are going to take some work to do.
And the key question, again, coming back to the therapy, not just addressing the problem, what could these three communities, I mean, you're very relevant communities, the three of you, what could you do to speed up? You say ultimately it can be solved.
I'm hoping.
Well, let's
hoping.
assume that we're all optimists here. So what can we do to speed that up?
So on that last point that George just made, I think that's already happening in the private sector. I don't think that portion is going to wait on the government. In other words, in order to be able to do our jobs effectively for the membership that we serve, you're already seeing that happen in the private sector. You also already see investment dollars going into that space already to be able to do that type of longitudinal work. So I don't believe that we have to wait on the FDA, to be honest, and there's nothing wrong with the work that the FDA is doing. So I don't want to be misunderstood on that because I think they're doing great work. I just don't think that that's a situation where we in the private sector are saying we're looking for the FDA to decide how we're going to be able to go after that particular data and get clinical integration. That's already happening. The issue for us is that as that's continued to evolve, how do you structure it in a way so that that information actually flows? Because what we want to try to avoid or at least decrease the risk is that suddenly you have situations, particularly at least for us where you're across the United States, where you have people, lives impacted purely based upon their geography or the zip code they live in, and so that you might have certain treatment options and modalities that are effective purely because they've already done clinical integration in that particular community, and another community where it's not fully formed, they're falling behind. And so that's where we're already starting to move towards, is try to understand how do we do this in a way on the private sector side that allows that information to flow as much as possible. It does require, just so you know, it does require some different business models, because traditionally the way that that information has happened is that it's been isolated and linked into the intellectual property at the local level. And we're already starting to explore, does that mean that there's a different business model? It's early, but is there a different model related to data streaming, things that we traditionally are used to in the consumer side, right? So all of you might have some type of streaming, whether it be music, whether it be video, that you're accustomed to. Is there some different business model around data in the private sector side that allows for that to occur versus constantly fighting this battle of hoping the government creates some big database while we try to move forward?
Okay.
I think and perhaps this is teeing up the next, fireside or bonfire chat, but really trying to come to some understanding quickly on how we use real-world evidence, how we use broader data beyond randomized controlled trials, and particularly working with the FDA and other major regulators, because we can't, again, have the Europeans tell us we want to use one way, and then the FDA another way, and the Japanese another way, and the Brazilians a fourth way. So really trying to come to some, common understanding pre-approval, and this is in the pre-approval space, how you can use a broader data set than randomized controlled trials, how you can gain more information, reliable, valid information during a development program, which often now is, many, many hundreds, over thousands of people. How do you get that data quickly and in a reliable way, not necessarily through the randomized controlled trial, which is rigid, which is expensive, which is complex. Now, technology is going to help us do randomized controlled trials a little more quickly and a little more cheaply, but it's still a randomized controlled trial, and we know that that's not really the most reliable environment when we think about the real world setting. So how do we bring these worlds together? How do we create that database? How do we create that data set to provide evidence for both regulatory approval and payer acceptance in a way that is going to sort of take some of the boundaries away from those RCTs, which is where so much of the cost lives. I think trying to crack that nut and get to it quickly, I think is going to be very helpful.
So you present it as a nut. Who can crack it? And I would like to use the last 13.5 minutes of this panel to invite any questions or ideas from the audience. Especially not making more diagnoses, but if you can, offer more therapies.
So I will offer a therapy. I'm Jane Perlmutter, maybe the only patient advocate in the room. And I see you have an empty chair. And one of the stakeholders that you left out here is the patient. And I think that they could be part of the solution. I've heard, I'm not sure when in this meeting, that when you opened up patient records to the patients, they really liked it. And they made corrections. And it improved healthcare. And it decreased the cost. And I think that's part of the solution. Likewise, in these expensive clinical trials, we do know that patient-reported outcomes differ from clinician-reported outcomes, or at least toxicities, and I think they're more important for value. And they can be collected pretty cheaply. Now, we still have some technology barriers, and we have some startup costs, but that's volunteer activity. Do it respectfully, and I think that's part of the solution. So fill that chair next time.
Okay, I don't know who put that chair up. What do you have to say to that?
Well, patient-reported outcomes, I think, to that last point, is going to continue to grow in relevance. I know that's one of the areas that we spend a lot of time focused on. How do we start to bring in and incorporate that information? Because one of the reasons why I talked about if we reach agreement about outcomes measures, then we can talk about aligning those incentives, because if we have patient-reported outcome measures as a component of that, and we all agree that that's important for whichever ones that we're looking at, that could feed into the value-based payment model. So we do believe that patient-reported outcome measures are going to continue to be important.
Sorry, a quick question before we come to the gentleman here. Patient-reported outcomes, everybody agrees that they are important. Fine.
Excuse me.
Do you see a discrepancy between what would be acceptable to payers and what would be acceptable to regulators? Hilary?
Yeah, absolutely.
Short answer, you see a difference?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think if you speak to a regulator about patient-reported outcomes, the validation you have to go through, the way the data are collected, it's a big deal. Now, I'm not saying that the data aren't rigorous, because the data are rigorous. But I think when you talk to payers, they find patient-reported outcome measures much more, they're much more interested in the value of that as value is determined. Regulators, patient-reported outcomes for regulators is a very high hurdle. It's a much more useful tool when having a conversation with payers, and it's a very high hurdle when you have a conversation with regulators.
I hate to say this, but I tend to agree. If I look at my own community, my colleagues, they would say the same. They would say, oh, well, that's, yeah. And one of your famous colleagues, Gerald, once said, well, the EQ5D, meaningless dribble. And all the payers love it. Yeah? So I think I agree, there is a bit of an issue that we have to resolve, and some cultural rapprochement might be called for. Sir.
Hi, John Lowy, Data Forethought. I'd like to make first a comment that we keep talking about real-world evidence when we really should first be putting our emphasis on real-world data that we would like to convert to real-world evidence. I think we are branding this idea that we're able to come up with this real-world evidence as if it's just like flipping a coin and being able to predict whether it's heads or tails. However, we do have data. We have data right now that we could have access to if we would get a groundswell of agreement, and that is the dossiers of SAS data sets that people have put into a standardized format, the study data tabulation models, at least in the United States, where they are now by law, having to be created, for the randomized controlled studies that all of the industry puts together. And they basically hold on to that. They will not let us look at that because it's going to it needs to be protected for their personal use. But it seems to me that after products have been out in the market for a while, and companies have made billions of dollars on some of these products, why can we not get access to these randomized controlled studies that have already been done, so that using the 21st Century Cures Act, for which we are supposed to get real world evidence, or how to get it, we can be using those particular data sets that have been collected meticulously and in those randomized controlled trials to create priors, informative priors for those Bayesian analyses, so that we can minimize the number of patients on ineffective treatments.
So, Hilary, a short answer to a very passionate question.
I completely agree with you, and I think what you will find, what you will see, I believe, across many companies now, is a much greater acceptance, a much greater willingness to actually move that data more quickly into, I'll call the public domain, into a broader forum, because I think what most companies and the industry understands actually is having those many eyeballs and having those many ideas. Not only does society demand it, but actually it can be very, very useful, rather than just a small cohort that you have within the company actually looking at the data. So I think you have to think about the time frame. I mean, you legitimately said that we're all learning about new drugs, particularly. One has to learn in a somewhat controlled fashion before, I think it becomes a funnel. But I think you'll find that most companies are now, particularly big pharma, are very, very willing to think about moving those data out more quickly.
One quick follow-up. FDA, on the Freedom of Information Act, I have tried to go through that organization, and it is so cumbersome and difficult to get that information in any sort of a useful fashion, and the amount of time one has to wait. You could make that a little easier for us to get at as well.
So maybe you can resolve that over coffee.
Okay.
We have been through a big debate on data transparency and all that. So I would agree we are not there, but we are on the right track, going in the right direction. Stella.
Hi, Stella Blackburn from IQVIA. I think one of the ways we could get greater convergence is if we stop talking about patient-reported outcomes. What we should be talking about is reporting outcomes that are important to patients. And once we've talked with patients and find out what actually matters to them, surely then that is a sort of evidence that would be useful for both regulators and for payers and for companies.
Any comment on that?
Well, the sentiment is absolutely valuable. As someone that used to have to do measurement at CMS, those nuances actually become quite fraught with operational implementation issues. And so without knowing a little bit more about the sentiment I don't think anybody would disagree with in terms of what that might mean for implementation. If you're not careful, we could get into that type of debate and you could actually derail the whole movement as it relates to whether or not you even incorporate patient-reported outcomes. So I'll caution people, because again, I had to do quality measurement, and you would get into debates about the measures in and of itself, and other people would say, well, while you guys figure that out, which could take a few years to figure out that debate, they keep moving on with the entirely other different measurement sets. So I caution about getting into some of those debates unless we're clear about the operational implementation for that particular issue.
Okay. Sir?
Craig Gibson from Tesaro. My comment is very similar to what Stella was saying, but maybe a bit more specific to what you're saying. I'm thinking more specifically about the patient input into the relevance of surrogate endpoints. Because there are certain agencies in different countries where, even in oncology, OS, overall survival, is the only thing that they consider as relevant. Things like progression-free survival are stated as not being patient-relevant outcome without getting the patient input on whether the patients believe this to be the case. So if there's a way of getting agreement, even at the trial setting, before talking about the real-world evidence, on what are the right endpoints that can be collected that patients actually care about, even if they're not patient-reported outcomes, is there any way to try to incorporate that into the regulatory thinking?
Give me just what do you mean? Like, so let's say, like in our world, so 106 million members, you would, for those 106 million members, you would want what to occur with those 106 million members?
I'm not so much thinking about from a particular plan perspective, but when it comes to an industry perspective, when they have to design a trial and set up the endpoints, can we get agreement that there are certain endpoints? We don't have to go with only the hard stop, so that we can also look at surrogate endpoints that can be collected much more rapidly, as opposed to waiting until the final ones come out.
I think I get the question, because we're in the midst of that debate. We're being accused of authorizing drugs based on progression-free survival.
Right.
And there are some critics who say that has no meaning for patients. They may still die at the same time because it doesn't translate into improved overall survival. And I think what I heard you say is, shouldn't the ultimate arbiter of that question be the patient and not the NGOs versus the agencies? Fair point, yeah? I would agree. Madam.
Good morning, everybody. Deborah Schomburg from Avidera. Prior to that, I was at Harvard for a number of years and worked in a group that was at the forefront of pragmatic trials, which is a word that hasn't come up very much from yesterday to today. And so I'm interested in the perspective, particularly from the EMA and the FDA, on the role of not just platform trials, but pragmatic trials, looking at that as a continuum and sort of revisiting how we're doing the development in the first place, and do we really need to be doing it the way we're doing it? Can we fold in more pragmatic elements, include a wider group of patients, for example? Because another thing that hasn't really come up in the conversation is that not only are the trials complex and expensive, but we tend to focus on a very narrow segment of the population that eventually would be eligible to get the drug.
Do you want to start?
So the classic RCT has a lot of very good features, and it's got some of the negative features of the narrow population, excluding patients who will appear in the real world. I think moving forward, the issue is to take those elements of the RCT that are useful for making inferences and see how we can leave behind maybe some of the more burdensome aspects and replace them with more use of other types of evidence. So randomization itself is something that is quite valuable, and it sort of avoids this channeling bias and other things. The question is, can you take randomization and then put it into a system like Sentinel or something like that? There's a trial now going on called Impact AF, where the intervention is not a medicine, but information about medicines or about a condition. atrial fibrillation. That's why it's called AF. And we'll see how that works.
Yeah. But we had one large pragmatic trial that was the basis for an authorization, the famous Salford lung study. I guess everybody knows it. And so from a regulatory perspective, we accept that. But there isn't much enthusiasm, I have to say, if you listen to companies, to do that. But maybe one last question. Sorry, very short, please, because we have only 55 seconds.
Just a very quick comment. So I know about the Salford lung study and others, but if you look at, and we did this, all of the randomized trials that are going on, less than 1% of them are pragmatic trials right now.
Yeah. Okay.
Right, that makes sense.
Dan, last question, please.
Yeah, this will be very short. I'm really glad that you got Trent invited into Gerald's office. So the provocative solution I'd put forth is you, Hans-Georg, and others have written about E2E, and there's been adaptive licensing in Europe that puts a pragmatic trial after a licensing trial. When is it going to happen in the United States that we don't individualize the E2E kind of pathway, but make it transparent at the FDA so that we can couple a large pragmatic trial that perhaps Trent will help design into subsequent licensing, like they do in Europe?
Gerald, that was a short question begging a short answer from you.
We have a whole program under PSUFA 6 to look at real-world evidence, real-world data. I think we're going to be thinking very broadly about all these things.
Okay. So time is up for us. What we heard is there will very soon be a meeting where these three people will be gathering, I presume, at FDA offices to move the world forward. Solved all the questions. Thank you very much.
I have my ticket to White Oak ready.
Yeah. Solved all the questions.
Well, thank you very much, panel. And it lived up to its bonfire images, I must admit. So you did not disappoint in any way, and tremendous progress being made. So thank you for that. We're going to continue now pushing this into a more pragmatic approach, if you might, if you pardon the pun, of evidence planning and adaptive biomedical innovation, sort of field observations, what's actually being done that some of these people on this panel have already seen done and are looking to improve. And our moderator is Kay Larholt, who, if you did not know, is one of the chief organizers of this event. And could we give her a round of applause just for that before we get into the moderator?